Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so pleased to have you. My name is Erin Gilbert.
And I'm Rachel Jones.
First, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to Courtney Martin, the director of the Yale Center of British Art, for this invitation, to Jane, the head of public programs, and for Linda for working with us to make this come to fruition. I'd also like to thank Tom Hunt of Thaddeus Ropack for his support and the entire gallery, as well as Zoe Whitley, director of the Chisenhale Gallery, whose exhibition is up now, currently called Say Cheese. We'd like to enter you into this conversation with both a series of images and a response to a series of images from an exhibition entitled Smile. And the poem, which Rachel will read for you now, was written by someone she invited, and I invite her to share more about that individual later on in the talk. But please join us now for images and a brief poetry reading.
Okay, so Vanessa Onwuzemi was invited to write a poem in response to the show, the paintings that I made. And this is an excerpt from the text that she produced entitled Smile. Intoxication informs we need a certain purity of feeling. Color is revealed by clear light, formed by the line reaching out and eating through the noise, a heavy task, forging its path. And so shape emerges. Remember, out of one emerges its opposite, and both are mingled in intimacy. Microcosm within microcosm, hell within paradise, one self within another. We smile at our own illusions, eventually. Smile contains the knowledge of what happened here. Mouth portal into a bottomless depth, adorned with cheap and happy flowers. Joy, undone tooth by tooth. Mouth portal, numinous circle through which exterior becomes interior. The interior that escapes the word, escapes into a beyond black, undone into a frayed noise, a knowing static. We are mapped. Because dust eventually settles, blood and liquid congeal into solids at some point. The vital body decays in livid bruises of mold, eventually. Becomes hoarse and noiseless again. We are mapped and contained within this all that has once been and all that is now, all that could be. This is all. And as with time for the dead and the yet to be born, the line has no direction, but eats itself as it curves around, as the breath is round in and into belly, extending ache the sweet of rot. We are blinded in sight. We might then see what it is. We have here mapped out in front of us. Joy, the primordial system that bends us into shape. The transparent intersection that fruits our bodies into being. Smile when you remember what had been forgotten. Smile, it cannot ever be forgotten.
Thank you, Rachel. For those of you who are not familiar with Rachel, for whom this is your introduction both to Rachel and her practice, I'd just like to tell you a bit about her. First, it's her birthday.
Yes.
And so Rachel was born approximately 31 years ago here in London. She completed her BA in Fine Art at Glasgow School of Art in 2013 and an MA in Fine Art at the Royal Academy Schools in London in 2019. Her work has been exhibited at the UK institutions such as the Royal Scottish Academy in a group exhibition alongside Gillian Ayres and now Matasonga, at the New Art Centre in Salisbury. And this was followed by her inclusion in Mixing It Up, painting today at the Hayward Gallery in last year. She's also had a solo show, which is currently on view at the Chisenhale Gallery in London. She was an artist in residence at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas in 2019, and the Masterworks Museum Bermuda Art in 2016. What you're seeing here is just a small slice, literally, of Rachel's practice and performances. And with that, we are ever so pleased again to be with you today. I encountered Rachel's work first approximately 2 years ago in 2019 and 2020 on a sneak trip to London at the height of the pandemic, and was immediately affected by it, so much so that I asked for a studio visit, and Rachel was gracious enough to grant me a studio visit on my last day in town. I think I showed up ready to go to the airport shortly thereafter. And in the course of our conversation, many things revealed themselves. But at the time, I had recently completed a book, or was in the midst of a book, called The Sovereignty of Quiet by Kevin Quashie. And so she and I began to talk about this notion of sovereignty, this notion of quiet, and what it had meant for us, especially as Black women coming out of a set of protests and still being in the pandemic, to have adopted this set of ideals. So I want to share with you, before we get into our conversation, a bit about that book and its premise, since it has been formative in Rachel's practice. Kevin Quashie writes, quiet is often used interchangeably with silence or stillness, but the notion of quieting the pages that follow, is neither motionless nor without sound. Quiet, instead, is a metaphor for the full range of one's inner life, one's desires, ambitions, hungers, vulnerabilities, and fears. Instead, quiet is not apolitical or without social value, but neither is it determined entirely by publicness. In fact, the interior, dynamic and ravishing, is a stay against the dominance of the social world. It has its own sovereignty. It's hard to see, even harder to describe, but no less potent in its ineffability. He goes on, quiet is the capacity to ask questions about life in the abstract, not merely questions about life as it is defined by identity. So Rachel, I want to start by asking, after you read that book, how did it affect you? How did it affect your practice?
I think the most pertinent thing for me, taking in that text as a whole, was that there are multiple examples of how to live a life of reflection and quietness, and that in itself is a mode of existing that can be resistant to things that are oppressive, but it can be nourishing in a way that isn't often visible or isn't necessarily given a space to be discussed as like a necessary way of living and nurturing oneself, and also processing what is happening to you within an environment or internally. And so considering these things really helped me think about what my relationship to making paintings is, and what that process means to me, but also what that might mean for an audience as well, considering the types of paintings that I make, because they are very, I would say, quite chaotic maybe, and really colourful, but in a way that wrestles with how to balance colours in a way that is discordant, but also sweet as well. So I think considering my own interiority and what that is as a landscape, or what the emotional value is of my inner world, I was able to think about using my painting as a space to reflect on those things, but also give other people hopefully an opportunity to do the same thing. And the way the paintings are made, there's this idea that the color is a form of language that encourages like an inward looking, or an emphasis on thinking about your body as a vessel for feeling a painting or experiencing a painting with your body or with your senses, not just your intellect. So I just really enjoyed it for the many directions it sort of pushed me into, and emphasizing like the significant value there is in creating a space for yourself to really be free and form an expression which is individual but also connected to so many things around you. And yeah, it kind of spurred me on in a way that I hadn't been before. So
I found this statement around the notion of experiencing with your entire body exactly what happened to me. I remember being in Thaddeus Ropac and seeing one of the smaller works and literally feeling chills from the top of my head to the soles of my feet and thinking, there's something here I've never seen before. Having spent a great deal of time with abstract artists, abstract women artists, particularly from the Deep South and the Global South, women of African descent, I'd been thinking about the way that we make. What is this as a mode of expression that is abstract, right? That removes the figure in many ways, but is still about that sense of emotionality and about identity in some of its ways. I've been thinking about Mary Lovelace O'Neill and, her series. And I thought about, Sylvia Snowden. I thought about Grace Hardigan and Cicely Brown. I thought about even Elaine de Kooning in Bullfight. And I thought about even Mary Abbott, her work, Haiti. You see all these kind of expansions of color and gestural painting, but you are really, as you say, thinking about not anything exterior, but something extremely interior. And we've talked about this in brief, but I'd love for you to share with the audience what other writers have influenced you, because more than any of the painters I could name, you have been more influenced by writers. So who are the writers and what other writing has influenced your practice?
I'm really interested in works by female writers, and particularly like Black female writers. So Toni Morrison is an example that stands out immediately, and Alice Walker, and poetry by writers such as Lucille Clifton and Gwendolyn Brooks. And just thinking about how their skill in crafting, for me, like my experience of reading their text, like they craft multiple layers of experience via the way they communicate. There is the interaction of the words on the page, my voice reading them, and then there are images that are painted in my mind's eye, and there are the like threads of thought that take me to places outside of the text but are still linked to my experience of the text. And Toni Morrison specifically, the way she writes and speaks about color and the significance that color has as a symbol or a mode of expressing a character's emotional landscape or a space that they're in, like internally, that really enabled me to understand how color can be a signifier for something that goes beyond the formal aspects of the way color might be used in a painting. And it really registered with me because the way I understand color is a very physically like I don't know, like engendered reaction. Like I move when I think of color. I think of like taste, I think of touch. It's a very sensual experience or relation I have to it, and it makes me feel alive thinking about color. And I wanted that to be part of the way people encounter the work, so that the color is communicating something to them, which is both specific but also universal.
Well, let's talk about color for a minute. I think that you have so much red, so much fleshy red and bright red and maroon hues and almost magenta hues. But the red would feel like the ground if I didn't know the painting better because of how expansive it is. And throughout each one of these canvases, raw canvases for the most part, right? There are these swaths of red that take up emotional space and physical space. So what is it about red? Because red also figures in the titles. Sometimes we have, reds too. So let's talk about the color red as a beginning.
I think that it comes from like a personal like love of red. Like it's my favorite color. So instinctually, I am always drawn to the things that I'm most excited by when I'm making a painting. And that's the color that I use to, as you said, create like a sense of balance and foundation for the work. And in a very practical way as well, it's when you think of depictions of mouths, they'll often be red or pink. So it made sense when I was making paintings of teeth or lips that there was a suggestion of like a bodily tone or color attached to that. But it also was interesting for me to be able to work with that color because it works differently with other colors. It can be used to create a sense of life or like vivacity or like bodily lustfulness, like, like a real feeling of yeah, like pleasure or passion. Yeah, exactly. But then it can also be toned down and muted and cool in certain instances. And it's interesting for me to use it in a way where it's being maybe engaged with counterintuitively within the other context of the colors in the painting. So yeah, it's like a starting and finishing point.
When you say counterintuitively, I think part of the interaction with this lime green electric kind of tennis ball yellow that tends to be repeated also within it, or even with browns, which is, I think, even more counterintuitive, seems to work so harmoniously in the paintings. But let's talk about the medium and how that may even allow for it, right? Your process is raw canvas, and then acrylic, and then oil stick, and pastel. So let's talk about that.
So with the stretched works, I will prime them myself with rabbit skin glue. So the color of the canvas, like the cotton duck, is creamy, and it sets a tone for the colors that I put on top, where I will cover the surface completely with lots of different colors. And then from those colors, I will respond to what's in front of me and develop certain areas in pattern. And eventually I figure out where I want a lip line to come in, or some teeth, or recently the patterns that are repeated throughout the paintings, which are mimicking flowers, like, or petals of flowers, or there are circles that appear, as you can see in this image here. And I think that it's most enjoyable for me to work in a way that isn't planned and is intuitive, and working with oil pastels and oil sticks enables that in a way that I didn't quite experience when I was painting, because there's a process of mixing that's involved, and there's like a time delay with thinking about the colors you want to create and produce, and then how to make those to then carry on with the painting. Whereas with these works, because I'm working with pastels and oil sticks, they come in the color that they are, and I just work immediately with them. So there's this immediacy that I get to go from the table with the pastels to my hand to the painting, and not breaking that train of thought, and working in this rhythm of motion really enables me to work quickly and to be in sync with how I'm feeling, and to respond instantaneously to the things that are before me in terms of the colors. And that's what's really enjoyable. And I think there's this sense of, like, excitement in figuring out how to produce the picture, like, based on what's in front of me, like, because there's no initial plan for what a work will look like. It's a moment where I get to really engage and be present with the painting and think, what does it need, or what balance needs to be created, or what friction can I create, or where are there spaces of rest or reprieve for the person, where it's just ground that's visible, and where is there more of a clustered moment of pattern and line work happening. So I think the material really enables for those sorts of considerations to happen. And it's nice to be able to work that way.
You started out with a practice that really allowed us to see the mouth, and was much more specific in its boundaries and lines that gave us teeth and the inner mouth, and the sensibility that you were in the scape that felt like a mouth, a landscape that is really an oral landscape. But it has become more abstracted over time. So the body of work that's on view now is much more deceptive to enter into, in that if you don't necessarily know it's a mouth, or that these are teeth, right? You do see these repeated motifs of the circle, these kind of spaces in which you say they're clusters of color and layers that feel textural. They feel as though they're a bit more like impasto. How did you decide to go from what made sense very easily, very legibly, as a mouth and as teeth, into this space of a much more kind of cacophony of color, and a set of more abstracted mouths? They are still mouths, they are still teeth. But how did you make that transition, and why?
I mean, I originally started focusing on, like, the mouth as a starting point to maybe talk about some of the things I was interested in, because it seemed to encompass lots of different things at one time, and there were these different perspectives that you could take in thinking about what a mouth might mean as an image within a painting. There are ideas of interiority, but also what is outside of the body, things that enter and are expelled from within. And then as a site itself, like the mouth is a part of the body where you experience so many different types of sensations, both pleasurable and painful. And, you know, there are things that you can only really experience as a way of, I suppose, enjoying your body through like things being entered into it or being taken out. And I think that the mouth does that in a way that is multifaceted, and there's this accessibility for everybody to think about what their relationship is to their own mouth or other people's mouths. And then culturally there's a significance as well in terms of how certain people's mouths might be represented. And so historically the depictions of Black people's mouths has been littered with like offensive or mocking depictions of our mouth. But now we're living in a time where our lips are often fetishized, and there's a whole history about how we have reclaimed a sense of expression over our mouths by decorating our teeth with grills or like having gold teeth, you know. Absolutely. So it's a site for creativity as well. So there are all these things that could be discussed, and I wanted, I think at the beginning, for the mouth to become a symbol in a way that as it was repeated throughout each series of paintings, it would start to develop a narrative of its own. And they were quite figurative at the beginning because I wanted it to be something that people could see, even though it wasn't particularly literal. There's a suggestion that there's something which has a natural form to it, and it could be described as something that's pertaining to a body. But now that I've made a few series of the paintings, I think the interest for me has been in how far I can push that and how much I can place the mouth within a landscape so that it doesn't take up the entire space of the canvas. And instead of it being like an entity, it becomes something that morphs into the space that it's part of. And there's this kind of merging with the background, and it exists in different planes. And so that's kind of what I've been doing recently. And that's what's in, I would say, the paintings at Chisenhout at the moment.
I want to read for the audience just the titles, because you've been so consistent, and we can talk about the narrative behind some of these bodies of work. But for those of you who may be looking at or have looked at the images and thought, there are no titles, there are no measurements, there's no dates. The reason is because within her bodies of work, each work within the series has the exact same title. So you began with I'm Not Clean, which was actually figurative.
Yeah, these are figurative works, yeah.
Right? And then Red Cranes in the Dirt, which really feels like you're moving right into abstraction, right into this moment of red, and almost reminded me of Alma Thomas's early work, for those of you who are familiar with that. And then Sugarcane Plantation, and then The Black in Their Face, and then Mad Dogs.
Yeah.
And then we go back into mouths.
Yes.
2019, Red Shaped Mouth, which was the Chinati Foundation.
Yeah.
A Slow Teething, immediately there. Then A Sovereign Mouth, and then Lick Your Teeth.
Beso Clutch.
Beso Clutch.
Yeah.
And then Smile, and then Say Cheese, which is where we are now.
Yeah.
So within these bodies of work, you've talked about how initially there was narrative. Can we talk a little bit about how these abstract works can have narrative? Because most people think abstraction is antithetical to both being politicized and to narrative.
I mean, the titles really help with that. I think, you know, that I wanted to give people a bit of a placeholder so that when they came to the work, even if it wasn't apparent to them where there might be a tooth or a line of teeth or a mouth, the title suggested that there is a body being discussed, or there's an aspect of a body that is being considered within the work, or it's something I would like you maybe to think about when looking at the painting. And so I'm interested in how I can use language as a prompt, but also as something that can be ambiguous in what it's telling you or what it's sharing with you. So with some of the titles, like the most recent ones really, lick your teeth, face so clutch, smile, and say cheese. They're all things that you can imagine someone saying. And so there's this question of who is speaking, like whose voice is instructing someone, who are they talking to? And in some ways, the titles are very celebratory or maybe pertain to like a joyful sort of instruction.
And we should note for those who aren't looking at it that smile
it's got lots of I's and L's and E's. So it's like smile, like that's
exactly.
how you
and say cheese has
say
5
cheese.
E's.
So it's kind of like there's this oral note to it, but also, you know, when you think about who's telling who to smile, and you know, I think we've all been in situations where you've been asked to perform for someone,
the real smile versus the smile
exactly. And there's this sort of like movement from it, maybe instead of it only being a way to look at the work in a positive or a joyful light, there's a slightly more ominous undertone, or there's this idea of an instruction coming from someone who isn't particularly generous to the person they're speaking to, or there's a slight shift in level of comfort. And that's something I think that the images do in terms of the colors being quite, you know, frenetic and like frantic, but also I want that sort of energy to be present in the titles, and even like the older ones, like a slow teething, like to make someone think about a tooth being grown in your mouth. Like it's a painful process that none of us remember as children, but it's not a pleasant image to like have in your mind. Like this idea of something like jutting out of a gum to insert itself, and the necessity of that for you to be able to eat and to be able to talk. So it's interesting to think about like how you can paint pictures in people's minds that relate to the mouth, but also take them into other spaces of thinking about sound and speaking and the language around those things and the hierarchies of language and how we communicate with one another. So
exactly. You know, I read quite a few, as many as I could, kind of reviews of your practice. And for the Dallas exhibition at 1226, a writer named Molly Cranston says of A Sovereign Mouth, she says, "Here Jones nimbly oscillates between the quiet and the cacophonous. Jones has formed a visual language of, but not from, the mouth to further study representations of Blackness. The mouth is sovereign in that its threshold to the internal. The interior is communicated or protected by what mouths will and won't do, quiet or public, withholding or giving, speaking, kissing, crushing, swallowing. The only way through is the mouth and its passages." And I thought she really understood in many ways that the fact that this is a very new visual language that I feel like you're forming, one that, as you say, you can hear when you encounter the work. You can hear it, you can feel it. I think, you know, walking through the exhibition today, I started to respond to its rhythm, right? And so as my body was responding to its rhythm, and we talked about your intention around that, you said that response is like your making, right? That you're coming into and out of and around it. And I think it is that sensibility that the viewer does have, that it is not a static or captive solely experience, right? And that we do all speak this language because we do all have mouths. There is that hierarchy, as you say, is kind of flattened in the fact that it is one of the things that we kind of all possess. Do you want to talk about the way that sound in particular? I mean, last night was a party, guys. I missed it, but there was a listening room, and Rachel invited, as she has invited so many, to respond to the work, a DJ musician who made a CD, and thankfully they did save me one. But Rachel, let's talk about for a moment the kind of rhythm of the paintings and the way in which you have evoked that bodily response, not just through the visual experience, but the relationship to the audio and the sound that you've invited into the space.
I think that like there is a really important and close relationship that I have to music, and it is a massive source of influence, but also the context that the work is made in is that I'm in a studio and there is always sound, like I'm always playing something. And when people come to visit me, like when Erin came to visit me, I was playing music, like there's always something on in the background. And it acts as like a source of energy and also a background for me to create from. It's both empowering but also meditative. Like it sets me into a certain space where I feel just really comfortable in the space that I'm in, and within that comfort I'm able to make, and things come out very easily. And I think creating a similar sort of experience within the gallery is difficult when these spaces are so often empty apart from the things on the wall, and they, depending where you're going to view the work, there can be this sense of you have to behave in a certain way when you're in this space, or you will have a certain type of experience when you're in this space and you're looking at the work. And I'm always interested in thinking about how to make the work more accessible and to move outside of these normative ways of engaging with visual art. And I've always been interested in working collaboratively with people, but painting is a relatively solitary practice. So music for me is a way into creating a more open territory for people to come and experience the paintings, but for me to also share the experience of making work and working with others in the realm that they're in, and seeing what the collision is when those two sort of things interact with each other. So when I asked Mike, who's a friend, to produce a sonic response to the show, it was a wonderful opportunity then to look at the paintings in the space with the sound playing, and it was wonderful. And I had no idea about what he was going to put together, and it was a really interesting sonic journey, because it was often stuff that you would listen to if you're going to get ready to go out for a party, or if you're doing the cleaning and you want to be motivated to get the hoovering done. It's kind of let's move your body, let's be really comfortable and free in expressing the channeling of music through your body. And there's this sensibility of this urge of wanting to use your body. And so that's something that I experience when I'm painting, and thinking about the way I can use color to help people have that sense of vitality or nourishment, or this sense of excitement, or if it's discomfort, still when you don't like something, you tend to move back from it, or there is some sort of physical reaction that you have. And I think it's emotional as well. And so music does that in a way that doesn't have to be explained. And so to have the pairing of sound and the paintings together, I thought it would just add another layer of experiencing the work, which helps people feel like there are different contexts for it to be engaged with that aren't just, based on visual languages or visual understanding of how to interpret the practice or the paintings.
But certainly a welcoming one.
Definitely.
And especially for demographics who, as you say,
Definitely.
may not feel welcome.
Yes.
Based on age, based on, social status, based on the familiarity of the practice of going to be in museums or galleries.
Yeah.
And it is not necessarily the case that you would hear your own type of music, right? That you would hear at home in a gallery space. So I think there's an element of welcome, but there's also an element that I think deeply connects to you as a performance artist, right? Your practice is a painting practice, also engages sculpture, but you have had these installations, these projects that have been about your own performance. So you want to talk about that briefly as well?
Yeah, I did a pro-Black karaoke last summer in a gallery that used to be a chicken shop in Northwest London. And I wanted, the timing of it, we would come out of several lockdowns over here. As you mentioned earlier, the year before, there've been a lot of protests around Black Lives Matter, and processing all of these things, I felt like I wanted to create a space that truly celebrated life and being a young Black woman in Britain and all there is to enjoy, as a person of color. And so I sang a set list of songs, and all of the artists that I sang were Black or identify as Black. And then I invited members of the public, my friends and family, to come and sing songs as well. But you were only allowed to sing if you were Black or identified as Black. And as you can see here, the space was decorated with images of things that influenced my practice. So on the bottom left, there's an image of Carrie Mae Weems. Yes, sister. And above that, and the net. Oh my gosh, the net always. And then there are images of the book that Erin first mentioned, The Sovereignty of Quiet. There's works by young artists, Cheyenne Julienne, rappers, Rico Nasty, Micah's in there, there's a picture of my mum. Deanna Lawson's there, there's an image of Nicki Minaj, there's Kerry James Marshall, and then there's images of nature as well. Like that's something that really informs the way that I engage, I think, with space and the world and looking and finding things. And so I wanted there to be an example of the things that influence the way that I make, but in a way that was quite, it was there to be engaged with, just like the pleasure of like seeing these pictures together. But depending on who you are, your positionality, you might know more about the context of these images and who some of these people are. And the fact that all of them are, basically the majority of them are Black women, was creating this like emphasis on like where I draw inspiration from, and like creating from the position of being a Black woman myself, like celebrating that. And it was really lovely to have people come and participate in that moment. And we made a sound recording of the entire night. So once it was over, that played on a loop in the space. And so, yeah, it's been amazing to have opportunities to work in a way that is going into the spaces that are outside of like institutions or commercial galleries, where art is existing in a more everyday way. And it's in a way that isn't intimidating, I hope, because you don't need to know anything about what I put on the walls, but you can hear like the remnants of like an event where there was a lot of love and there was a lot of celebration. And some people knew what some of the images were and some didn't, but they still got a sensibility that what I was celebrating was having agency and a real sense of self, and like that being something to think about in the context of making art and like how you might share that with people. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I am excited. We're going to take some questions. So
that went so quickly. We were speaking for 40 minutes.
We really, we're gonna, take a few questions, but before we do, and as we allow you all to kind of, enter your questions in the chat, in the Q&A rather, I want to offer one more thought process. And as you say, your practice is really opening up a door to interiority and through painting and through abstraction. And as you say, the other references have been literary. The other reference that came to me was Elizabeth Alexander and her set of essays called The Black Interior. And she describes it as follows. She says, the Black interior is a metaphysical space beyond the Black public every day toward power and wild imagination, that Black people ourselves need to be reminded of it. It's a space that Black people ourselves have policed at different historical moments. Tapping into this Black imaginary helps us envision what we are not meant to envision. Complex Black selves, real and enactable Black power, rampant and unfetishized Black beauty. And it felt as though when I reread some of these things that I was looking at one of your paintings that has this rampant and wild and unfetishized beauty and interiority simultaneously. I think that, if I could ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, as I look down and see who might have questions. I think about, again, this symbolism of the teeth. And for the one symbol that always came to me is this idea of the wisdom tooth and the tooth fairy, and the one that's taken from a child into the hand of a talisman and then into war as protection. Had you ever thought about those mythological moments around teeth and around even the wisdom tooth or the tooth fairy? Have those things been activated in your mind as you've been dealing with the narrative around teeth? Or is that just...
That's really interesting. I mean, I think the closest I've ever come to thinking about teeth in a more poetic sense is like a memory of reading Joseph Conrad's text, The Heart of Darkness, is that what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's The Heart of Darkness.
And the description of finding people in the Congo, in the jungle, and this idea of, I mean, it's so racialized, but this idea of their skin and their mouths being the thing that really strike the main character, and the fact that their teeth are described against this setting of like skin being described as like darkness, like true like blackness, and then this shining ivory wide, kind
The
of
Cheshire
Cheshire,
smile,
like
exactly,
that kind
smile.
and but the lustrousness of that and the fetishization of that, but the beauty and the seduction and inquisitiveness to like what this is, that is the most, I suppose, kind of like removed interaction I've had with the idea of teeth, and not being like as a site from within my body. But I think the idea of mythology is really important, because in some aspects what I'm attempting to do is to create my own historical narrative. Like someone once asked me when I was studying, they're like, where are your references from? Like, what are you referencing? And I was like, me, like I am making things that are about my personal and very like specific experience of living in this body, and like my emotional landscape and response to dealing with like my life, like living as a Black woman. And so I'm trying to create like a narrative that spans hopefully many, many years, because hopefully I live for
at least another 35 to 40 years. I'm counting on you.
Right. And so I'm kind of like self-mythologizing in a way, but I'm at the very beginning of that. So it's actually really, I think, fantastic that you're pointing out the fact that there are other ways for me to think about the mythology that I'm maybe trying to engage with, because obviously there's a history of that already, and something that we all engage with. Like, who doesn't like getting money from the Tooth Fairy?
Well, they gave you money because it's valuable, and I only learned that as I was thinking about this kind of why teeth, because it's important that it has meaning, and I know it has meaning to you, and I appreciate the way in which the knowledge of the colonial presence has been guised in this work, right? There's so much joy, there's so much color, and there's so much understanding of who we are in the world right now, and our ability to have, as you say, that full range of experience from tragedy to triumph. But this knowledge that, as you say, the encounter in that book, Heart of Darkness, was one of the first books I became incensed reading. But that sensibility that there is a presence, there is a power dynamic that ceases yet to be, it's underlying it all.
Right. And James Baldwin talks about it. And he writes about his teeth when he goes, was it to Switzerland or Sweden?
Stranger in the Village.
Yeah. And like how the children and the people there are just mesmerized by his mouth. And it's like this thing where you move between a grimace and a greeting, and this, again, like this wide opening, and like these white inviting, but maybe also threatening, like tombstones in your mouth. Like, what does that mean to the person that's looking, or the person that is doing the smiling or baring their teeth or opening their mouth? It's a very sensitive but also like poignant, I think, way of encountering someone, like thinking about their teeth. And it has indications that have something to do with class and race.
Absolutely.
And, there's just so much there. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so should we take
we'll stop talking now. We'll stop talking.
We'll do this all day. Nancy Ann Miller says, there is a play in your work. I think of Roger Hilton's The Wit and Hazard of Painting in your work, but there's also a force, a solidness, a stature. Might you talk about that strength underlying your work?
Oh, well, that's a very kind thing to say. Thank you, Nancy. And I also really like Roger Hilton, even though he was a tyrant. I think that I tried to create a foundation for myself where, because I'm only focusing really on replicating this one thing of like teeth or mouths over and over again, there's a structure that I'm working within that opens up room for me to do a lot of like explorative making. So I'm always trying to think about how to use the symbol that I'm working with as a springboard for playing with color, for thinking about scale in different ways, for thinking about the way I install the paintings in different ways. And that's something that has developed over the past 2 years, and really coming from Texas, like thinking about all these things together. It's not just about making an image, it's about the way you create a context for that image, and it's about the different ways that the image can be interpreted and like what does that mean. And so I think it's been really helpful for me to have this really simple starting point, and then from that I've been able to go in lots of different directions, but it's still grounded and rooted in something that I can always come back to, and hopefully it's something that people can always come back to themselves as well if they want to understand like where the work is coming from. So yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. And I'm going to, Emmy, take a little bit of your question where you say, I can see in your work how your time in Texas made an impact, but made you go to this area of the USA. Now, first, I want to double back to the first studio visit where I thought initially encountering the paintings that I was looking at mountain ranges. And I thought specifically I was looking at Texas mountain ranges because I'd spent time in Marfa, Texas.
Seriously?
Well, you don't remember this, but when I came to the studio and we were talking, I said, I feel like I'm encountering this Marfa, Texas space. And she said, well, I did this residency last year at Chinati, and the smaller works where you want to tell them how you made, because the scale is very important. I think in the exhibitions, all of our exhibitions, you'll see works that range from 6 feet to works that are about approximately 6 inches. So do you want to talk about the nature of those smaller works and
yeah, I mean,
what Chinati did to your practice?
Yeah, it was a very transformative experience. Being in the desert, and this I think is something I'd never quite experienced before, was truly truly transformational because of the amount of space that I was engaging with in a way that I never had seen, like just so much land and sky and the ground, and seeing everything that's happening on the ground and all this life, and it being in such a harsh setting but seemed to be so generous at the same time. And I wanted to really respect and honor like my position within all of that, and it just humbled me and made me think about a different like daily concern. So instead of being like on my phone, like always going somewhere, like always meeting someone, having to work, like go to bed, like eat, like this cycle, I was far more conscious of like paying attention to what's happening around me, because first of all, I didn't want to be harmed by something dangerous. And there was a lot of that, trust me. But also like thinking about how, as a person, how do you exist in an environment that doesn't really need you? Like you don't add anything to it. Like the life exists on its own terms. And so I wanted to fit in with that and like be at one with the space that I was in. And because I was there with the opportunity to make work, I didn't have to make anything. They're very clear about that. I wanted to make something that was a bit more measured and quiet, and I ended up making smaller paintings, partly because I could only take things back that would fit in my suitcase, but also because it was a way for me to come more in, and instead of working expansively and using my whole body to make a work, I was suddenly focusing a lot more on just using my hand and making more considered decisions about what information I would put on the painting, and building up material slowly over time and creating texture and this impastoed effect, and there being a different sense of touch and just like tactile like sensitivity that there isn't in the larger works. And I then was able to think about how to place them within the space that I had, because one of the things that was so amazing about the foundation is that there's like one work in a building and there are several buildings. So this idea of like giving a work an environment where it exists on its own and you can really meet it and spend time with it, and have like a different type of experience where you're not just moving from one thing to the next. Like there's a measured pacing and a movement, and it's a bit more like I don't know, like a bit of a pilgrimage, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to think about how can I do that with my own interactions with my paintings. And so I started to put things on the floor, which I'd never done before. And it's like, quite an odd thing to show a painting, which is often rarefied and treated as like a precious thing, to put it on the floor, right? A piece of paper on the floor, that's what it was. I made a vinyl sticker of one of my paintings and blew it up really large. So I was trying to engage with these questions of like the sanctified nature that we tend to consider painting within, and how to put it more in the environment that it's in, for it not to be just an image that's hung on a wall and put in a frame. and is removed from the space that it's in a way where it's just, I don't know, like engaged with in a very like historically like formal way. And so I think that was the thing that really influenced me when I came back to London, and I thought about how to hang my shows and thinking about the difference in scale and creating intimate moments with the smaller works, and then being more just relatable in scale and like touchable in a way that the larger paintings aren't. So
and you talk about the installation at Chinati, and for those who've been there know that this is a space Donald Judd founded, and where many minimalist artists had and have installations, Carl Andre, Ronnie Horn, but they have these barracks that are often light filled with natural light. And one of the changes that you made at Chisenhale for your viewing experience was to remove the coverings on the windows so that you would have what is similarly this kind of bar metalled natural light coming through. Do you want to talk about that for a moment? Because I see the correlation between the ways in which you would have experienced intimacy at Chinati and your really elegant, again, congratulations to the team at Chisenhale, with this 7 work exhibition with works that range in scale but are really in this full daylight.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about that space is that it's one large space. So I knew that this is my first opportunity to have all the work in one room together. And when I knew that there was a way to have natural light come in, that was the first thing I was like, we have to have that. And the way that the windows are positioned throughout this space, they create this sort of grid that runs along the top of the wall. And so they created this format and shape, and I wanted to kind of mimic that in the scale of the works, but also where they were situated. And so it was a way of creating like a foundation for the decisions that I made in terms of how many works there were going to be, where they would be placed in the space. Like I had all these ideas before I even made anything about how I would engage with that room. And it was predicated on there being light let into the space and how that would impact the way people move through this space. So we created this wall that you see as soon as you enter the gallery from like meters back, and it obstructs all the light. And then you get closer to it and you see that there are all these windows and you can move around the wall, and there's this openness and this generosity. And that's the thing that you get as a reward for going into this space. But the first encounter or experience you have of it is this like very large like kind of harsh and intense like image. And then beyond that, there are these other paintings that engage with that. And so it really just enabled me to think about having different emotional, maybe kind of experiences whilst you're in this space, and being moved from a position of being maybe confronted with something, and then being allowed to breathe or allowed to move. And I was interested in choreographing like a certain type of like journey through the gallery, because it then influenced how you see the works. And like I wanted there to be a sense of like a kind of path that people followed whilst they were there. So the windows and the light really aided that.
Let's take one more question. We have a few minutes left. So one of our anonymous attendees asked, why do you often choose to leave your canvases raw-edged and unstretched?
I think this also comes from Texas. One of the things when I arrived, I was like, oh, so when can I go to the art store? And they were like, there is no art store here. So when I got to the studio that they'd given me, Rob, who was the person I was spending most time with there, he found some canvas and rolls of like parcel paper for me to use to draw on. And some of them, some of the pieces of paper I got were already torn into these strange sort of shapes. And so I was like, oh, well, I don't want to be wasteful. Let's just use what I have here. And so that started a pattern of working on things that are often considered to be waste, like, the offcuts, the things that you just throw away. There was this playfulness and also sort of challenge to working with those sorts of surfaces to create a work. And again, thinking about this kind of what I would describe like austere relationship we have to to paintings, like the way a painting should be made, or the way a painting should be hung, or the way a painting needs to be looked at. Like there are all these, you know, silent rules that we all adhere to. And I think it's important to consider ways of making that push those parameters and help people think about other ways of engaging with painting and surface and the presentation of painting, or the preservation of painting. There's this huge thing with the unstretched works, like people panic about how to look after them. And I'm like, well, you know, the work doesn't have to live forever. I mean, I know that's probably not the most exciting reality for someone whose job it is to preserve conserve something. But my attitude to the work is that they're alive. The materials, like the pastels and the sticks, they don't dry really. So there's always this sort of like tackiness to them, where they, if you touch them, some of the material comes away. They gather dust because they just attach themselves to the painting. I recently received a picture of a bee on the painting at the gallery. Like obviously it was flying around from section to section, maybe because of the colors. And I was like, there's this aliveness to them, and this idea
feels like it's encountering a flower.
Right. And this idea that they're living, or that they have a temperament where they're affected by their environment. And I enjoy that aspect of the work. And what you said earlier about when people engage with them, you're not stood still, like static, like you're moving. And I think the work moves as well, like it has a life of its own. And working on the unstretched canvases really emphasizes that nature of the work. And it's really fun to have a shape that really pushes me to think differently about how I might create an image, because when it's not a rectangle or a square, you suddenly have to work with these curves or undulations that mean you won't have a necessarily easy time figuring out how to use that space. And like again, like that's another prompt for making something which is like maybe a little bit outside of the way I would normally work. And there's a bit of a tussle with doing that. And it's nice to have a variety of ways of thinking about making a painting, but also people have different reactions to the paintings being stretched and unstretched. So it's just about provoking as much conversation and thought as possible, but also experience for me in terms of making the work. So yeah.
Thank you for the question. You know, within your question initially was this notion of the professional. And I think what Rachel has said multiple times in multiple ways throughout this talk is that she's really interested in upending some of those notions. And by doing so, making the space of painting and making the space of experiencing painting, particularly abstract painting, much more accessible to communities for whom it feels inaccessible, or has felt inaccessible in the past. I'm so grateful to you to have been able to share this time with you and really share the space of wanting to make our work as accessible as we can to as many communities as we can, with hope that that enters us into multiple important dialogues about the ways in which we operate in the exterior space, but also our own attention to and care for and love of our interiors. So again, thank you so much to Yale, to Courtney, to Jane, to Linda, to everyone who joined us.
Yes, thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure to be able to share this space with you as well, Erin. Yeah, it's just been wonderful to be able to talk about the work, and you really touched on things I hadn't thought about as well. So I learned something as well today.
Thank you all for joining us.